Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram at snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Also, share us with a friend. And if you'd like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to the Snoozeletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by the Trill of Songbirds. Tonight, we'll read the next part to The Secret Garden, a novel by Frances Hodgson Burnett, published in 1911. Set in England, it's one of Burnett's most popular novels and seen as a classic of English children's literature. If you'd like to start from the beginning, the first episode aired March 9th, 2020. If you'd like to listen to this story's episodes easily in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. In the last episode, Mary wanders the halls of the manor alone on a rainy day. She finds some interesting things, like old-fashioned portraits of a girl that looks like her. She also finds a hidden hallway and hears the sound of a child crying again. Mary gets caught by Mrs. Medlock and thus ends her investigations for the day. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Chapter 7, The Key to the Garden. 2 days later, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha. "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" The rainstorm had ended, and the gray mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant, deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. In India, skies were hot and blazing. This was of a deep, cool blue, which almost seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely, bottomless lake. And here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful, dreary gray. "Aye," said Martha, with a cheerful grin. "The storm's over for a bit. It does like this at this time of the year. It goes off in a night, like it was pretending it had never been here, never meant to come again. That's because the springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming." "I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England," Mary said. "What? No," said Martha, sitting up on her heels among her black lead brushes. "Nothing of the sort. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it's sunny. I told thee that like the moor after a bit. Just you wait till you see the gold-colored gorse blossoms, and the blossoms of the broom, and the heather flowerin', all purple bells, and hundreds of butterflies flutterin', and bees hummin', skylarks soarin' up and singin'. You'll want to get out on it at sunrise and live out on it all day like Dickon does. Could I ever get there? Asked Mary wistfully, looking through her window at the far-off blue. It was so new and big and wonderful, and such a heavenly color. I don't know, answered Martha. You've never used your legs since you were born, seems to me. You couldn't walk 5 mile. It's 5 mile to our cottage. I should like to see your cottage. Martha stared at her a moment curiously before she took up her polishing brush and began to rub the grate again. She was thinking that the small, plain face did not look quite as sour at this moment as it had done the first morning she saw it. It looked just a trifle like little Susan Ann's when she wanted something very much. I'll ask my mother about it, she said. She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. It's my day out today, and I'm going home. Oh, I'm so glad. Mrs. Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps she could talk to her. I like your mother, said Mary. I should think you did, agreed Martha, polishing away. I've never seen her, said Mary. No, you haven't, replied Martha. She sat up on her heels again and rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand, as if puzzled for a moment. But she ended quite positively. Well, she's that sensible and hard-working and good-natured and clean that no one could help liking, whether they'd seen her or not. When I'm going home to her on my day out, I just jump for joy when I'm crossing the moor. I like Dickon, added Mary, and I've never seen him. Well, said Martha stoutly, I've told thee that the very birds likes him, and the rabbits, and wild sheep, and ponies, and the foxes themselves. I wonder, staring at her reflectively, what Dickon would think of thee. He wouldn't like me, said Mary in her stiff, cold little way. No one does. Martha looked reflective again. Martha went away in high spirits as soon as she had given Mary her breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles across the moor to the cottage, and she was going to help her mother with the washing and do the week's baking and enjoy herself thoroughly. Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew she was no longer in the house. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run round and round the fountain flower garden 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished, she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of those little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the first kitchen garden and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seems to have done him good. He spoke to her of his own accord. "Springtime comin'," he said. "Cannot thou smell it?" Mary sniffed and thought she could. "I smell something nice and fresh and damp," she said. "That's the good rich earth," he answered, digging away. "It's in a good humor, making ready to grow things. It's glad when plantin' time comes. It's dull in the winter when it's got naught to do. In the flower gardens out there, things will be stirring down below in the dark. The sun's warmin' 'em. You'll see bits of green spikes sticking out of the black earth after a bit." "What will they be?" asked Mary. "Crocuses and snowdrops and daffodillies. Has thee never seen them?" "No. Everything is hot and wet and green after the rains in India," said Mary, "and I think things grow up in a night." "These won't grow up in a night," said Weatherstaff. "Thou'll have to wait for 'em. They'll poke up a bit higher here, push out a spike more there, and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em." "I'm going to," answered Mary. Very soon she heard the soft, rustling flight of wings again, and she knew at once that the robin had come again. He was very pert and lively, and hopped about so close to her feet, and put his head on one side, and looked at her so slyly that she asked Ben Weatherstaff a question. "Do you think he remembers me?" she said. "Remembers thee," said Weatherstaff indignantly. "He knows every cabbage stump in the gardens, let alone the people. He's never seen a little wench here before. He's bent on finding out all about thee. Thou's no need to try to hide anything from him." "Are things stirring down below in the dark in that garden where he lives?" Mary inquired. "What garden?" grunted Weatherstaff, becoming surly again. "The one where the old rose trees are." She could not help asking, because she wanted to know so much. "Are all the flowers dead? Or do some of them come again in the summer? Are there ever any roses?" "Ask him," said Ben Weatherstaff, hunching his shoulders toward the robin. "He's the only one that knows. No one else has seen inside it for 10 years. 10 years was a long time, Mary thought. She had been born 10 years ago. She walked away, slowly thinking. She had begun to like the garden, just as she had begun to like the robin and Dickon and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha, too. That seemed a good many people to like when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long, ivy-covered wall over which she could see the treetops. And the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her, and it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there he was, hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he had not followed her. But she knew he had followed her, and the surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried out. "You do. You're prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he were showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Mistress Mary forgot that she had ever been contrary in her life when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him and bend down and talk and try to make something like robin sounds. Oh, to think that he should actually let her come as near to him as that. He knew nothing in the world would make her put out her hand toward him or startle him in the least, tiniest way. He knew it because he was a real person, only nicer than any other person in the world. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. The flower bed was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest. But there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed. And as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. Perhaps it is the key to the garden. Chapter 8. The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that it was the key to the closed garden, and she could find out where the door was. She could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was. They would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working, and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. In India, she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything. But in this place, she was beginning to care and to not know what to do about wanting to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather, at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not to be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever should find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. "Oh, it was pretty on the moor, with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage all smelt all nice. Clean hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickon, he said our cottage was good enough for a king to live in. In the evening, they had all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India and who had been waited on all her life until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about the Indians and about the ship you came in. I couldn't tell 'em enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you'll have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers." "My word," cried delighted Martha. "It would set 'em clean off their heads. Would you really do that, miss? It would be same as a wild beast show, like we heard they had in York once." India is quite different from Yorkshire, Mary said slowly, as she thought the matter over.